Hello mathematicians! Today we're going to be learning about fractions and decimals, more specifically about number lines counting by tenths. To get us started, here we have a number line, and notice that in between 0 and 1 we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 spaces. In between 1 and 2, we also have 10 spaces, and in between 2 and 3, we also have 10 spaces. That means that it takes 10 spaces out of 10 to make one whole. And when that's the case, we're going to be counting up by tenths. So to start us off, we're going to start off with 1 over 10. Then we have 2 over 10, 3 over 10, 4 over 10, 5 over 10, 6 over 10, 7 over 10, 8 over 10, 9 over 10, 10 over 10. Notice that when we get to 10 over 10, that is equivalent to one whole because 10 out of 10 spaces makes one whole. Then we have 11 over 10, which is equivalent to 1 1/10, 12 over 10, which is equal to 1 and 2 over 10, 13 over 10, which is equivalent to 1 and 3 over 10, 14 over 10, which is equivalent to 1 and 4 out of 10, 15 out of 10, which is equivalent to 1 and 5 out of 10, 16 out of 10, which is equivalent to 1 and 6 out of 10, 17 out of 10, which is equivalent to 1 and 7 out of 10, 18 over 10, which is equivalent to 1 and 8 over 10, 19 over 10, which is equivalent to 1 and 9 over 10, 20 over 10, which is equivalent to 2, 21 over 10, which is equivalent to 2 and 1 over 10, 22 over 10, which is equivalent to 2 and 2 over 10, 23 over 10, which is equivalent to 2 and 3 over 10, 24 over 10, which is equivalent to 2 and 4 over 10, 25 over 10, which is equivalent to 2 and 5 over 10, 26 over 10, which is equivalent to 2 and 6 over 10, 27 over 10, which is equivalent to 2 and 7 over 10, 28 over 10, which is equivalent to 2 and 8 over 10, 29 over 10, which is equivalent to 2 and 9 over 10, and then 30 over 10, which is equivalent to 3. Now, we don't need our improper fractions because we could simplify them to whole numbers or write them as mixed numbers. So here's our number line counting up by tenths. Here we have a vertical number line, and notice that in between 0 and 1, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 spaces. So we're also counting up by tenths here. So starting with 0, we're going to go 1 over 10, 2 over 10, 3 over 10, 4 over 10, 5 over 10, 6 over 10, 7 over 10, 8 over 10, 9 over 10, 1, 1 and 1 over 10, 1 and 2 over 10, 1 and 3 over 10, 1 and 4 over 10, 1 and 5 over 10, 1 and 6 over 10, 1 and 7 over 10, 1 and 8 over 10, 1 and 9 over 10, and 2. Now, let's take our fractions and write them in decimal form, starting off with 1 over 10. Now, in order to convert 1 over 10 to a decimal, we have to go ahead and divide the numerator divided by the denominator. So 1 divided by 10. Where 1 is going to be our dividend and 10 is going to be our divisor. We ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 1? Well, 10 does not go into 1, so we're going to add a 0 above it, and then a decimal point after the 1 and a 0 so we could keep dividing. Make sure that you bring up the decimal point, and then we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 10? In this case, we're going to ignore that decimal, and 10 goes into 10 one time, and that's because 10 times 1 is equal to 10. So we're going to subtract here, and 10 minus 10 is equal to 0. So that means we have no remainder, and 1 over 10 is equal to 1/10. So above the 1 over 10, we're going to go ahead and write that decimal. Now we're going to take 2 over 10 and convert that to a decimal. So we have to divide our numerator divided by our denominator, 2 divided by 10, where 2 is our dividend and 10 is our divisor. We ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 2? Well, 10 does not go into 2, so we're going to put a 0 there. And then after the 2, we're going to add a decimal point and a 0, and make sure you bring up the decimal point. Now we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 20? Well, 10 goes into 20 2 times, and that's because 10 times 2 is equal to 20. So we're going to add a 20 there, and then we're going to subtract. 20 minus 20 is equal to 0, so we don't have a remainder, which means that 2 over 10 is equal to 2/10. So above 2 over 10, we're going to go ahead and add that decimal. All right, moving on to 3 over 10. In order to convert this to a decimal, we have to divide the numerator divided by the denominator. So 3 divided by 10. Where 3 is going to be our dividend and 10 is going to be our divisor. We ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 3? Well, 10 does not go into 3, so above it, we're going to put a 0. And then in order to continue dividing, we have to add a decimal point and a 0 after the 3. Make sure you bring up your decimal point, and then we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 30? 10 goes into 30 3 times because 10 times 3 is equal to 30. We're going to put the 30 there, and then we're going to subtract. 30 minus 30 is equal to 0, so 3 over 10 is equal to 3/10. So on the number line above 3 over 10, we're going to add 3/10. Now moving on to 4 over 10. In order to write this as a decimal, we have to divide the numerator divided by the denominator. 4 divided by 10, where 4 is our dividend and 10 is our divisor. We ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 4? Well, 10 does not go into 4, so we're going to put a 0 there. And after the 4, we're going to add a decimal point and a 0 so that we could keep dividing. Make sure you bring up your decimal point. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 40? Well, 10 goes into 40 4 times, and that's because 10 times 4 is equal to 40. We're going to put the 40 there and then subtract. 40 minus 40 is 0, so we do not have a remainder, which means that 4 over 10 is equal to 4/10. So above 4 over 10, we're going to go ahead and put 4/10. Now moving on to 5 over 10. Again, we're going to divide the numerator divided by the denominator. So that makes 5 our dividend and 10 our divisor. We ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 5? Well, 10 does not go into 5, so we're going to put a 0 there. And then add a decimal point after the 5 and a 0. Make sure you bring up that decimal point. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 50? Well, 10 goes into 50 5 times, and that's because 10 times 5 is equal to 50. We're going to put the 50 there, and then we're going to subtract. 50 minus 50 is equal to 0. So that means that 5 over 10 is equal to 5/10. And on the number line above 5 over 10, we're going to go ahead and add 5/10. Moving on to 6 over 10. Again, in order to convert it to a decimal, we have to divide the numerator divided by the denominator. So 6 divided by 10, where 6 is going to be our dividend and 10 is going to be our divisor. We ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 6? Well, 10 does not go into 6, so we're going to put a 0 there. And after the 6, we're going to add a decimal point and a 0. Make sure that we bring up the decimal point. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 60? Well, 10 goes into 60 6 times, and that's because 10 times 6 is equal to 60. We're going to put the 60 there, and then we're going to subtract. 60 minus 60 is equal to 0. So we have no remainder, which means that 6 over 10 is equal to 6 tenths. So on the number line, we're going to go ahead and add 6 tenths above 6 over 10. Moving on to 7 over 10, in order to convert this to a decimal, we have to divide the numerator divided by the denominator. So 7 divided by 10, where 7 is our dividend and 10 is our divisor. We ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 7? Well, 10 does not go into 7, so we're going to put a 0 there. And after the 7, we're going to add a decimal point and a 0 to keep dividing. Make sure we bring up the decimal point, and then we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 70? Well, 10 goes into 70 7 times because 10 times 7 is equal to 70. We're going to put the 70 there, and then we're going to subtract. 70 minus 70 is equal to 0, so 7 over 10 is equal to 7 tenths. And above 7 over 10 on the number line, we're going to add 7 tenths. All right, so now we're going to take 8 over 10 and convert that to a decimal. So that means we're going to divide the numerator divided by the denominator, making 8 our dividend and 10 our divisor. So we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 8? Well, 10 does not go into 8, so we're going to put a 0 here. And in order to keep dividing, we have to add a decimal point after the 8 and a 0. Make sure we bring up the decimal point when we're dividing. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 80? Well, 10 goes into 80 8 times, and that's because 10 times 8 is equal to 80. Underneath, we're going to put the 80, and then we're going to subtract. 80 minus 80 is equal to 0. And now we have no remainder, which means that 8 over 10 is equivalent to 8 tenths. So above the 8 over 10, we're going to write 8 tenths. Now we're going to take 9 over 10 and convert that to a decimal. So we have to divide the numerator divided by the denominator, so 9 divided by 10, where 9 is our dividend and 10 is our divisor. So we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 9? Well, 10 does not go into 9, so it's going to be 0. And then in order to keep dividing, we have to add a decimal after the 9 and a 0. Make sure you bring up the decimal point. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 90? Well, 10 goes into 90 9 times because 10 times 9 is equal to 90. We're going to take this value and put it underneath. And 90 minus 90 is equal to 0. So we have no remainder. So above 9 over 10, we're going to put 9 tenths because 9 over 10 is equal to 9 tenths. Now here, notice that we have a pattern. We keep increasing by 1/10. So when we get to 1 and 1/10, the decimal is going to be the same as 1/10 with the exception that now we're going to have a whole number that's 1. Same thing for all these other fractions as well. The decimal is going to be the same, but the whole number is going to be 1 this time because we actually have a whole. Now, once we get to 2, These decimals are going to be the same, except the whole number this time is going to be 2. So here we have the decimal equivalent of increasing by 1/10. Now, if we had a vertical number line, we would also be increasing by the same decimal because here our number line is also split up into tenths. We have 10 spaces in between 0 and 1 and 10 spaces in between 1 and 2. So we're going to take the decimals from the previous slide and add them here, with the exception that now they're going to be going up instead of going to the right. So I'm going to add these for you on the number line. And that's it for number lines counting by tenths.